All right, today we're diving into what might just be the ultimate cold case. We're trying to solve a 4 billion-year-old mystery to find the ancestor of, well, everything alive.
So let me ask you something. Who's the oldest relative you know of? Maybe you've done one of those family tree things and traced it back a few hundred years, right? To some great-great-great-great-grandparent. Okay, now imagine scaling that up, way, way up. What if we could find the oldest relative of all life on Earth? I'm talking about you, me, the tree outside, the weird fungus growing on that tree, everything. The idea that every single living thing shares one common ancestor, well, that's the giant mystery we're getting into today.
Think of this as the ultimate cold case. We're going to need our detective hats for this one, because we're heading back in time nearly 4 billion years to hunt for the last universal common ancestor. And here's our, let's call it a person of interest, LUCA. That stands for the Last Universal Common Ancestor. Now, it's super important to know, LUCA wasn't the first life form, not by a long shot, but it's the most recent one that we all have in common. It's the organism sitting right at the trunk of the great big tree of life, before it branched out into everything we see today. And the timeline here is just mind-blowing. The Earth forms, things cool down enough for liquid water to exist, and then boom, almost immediately, in cosmic terms, we see the first chemical hints of life. We're talking a window of maybe a few 100 million years. That is an astonishingly short amount of time for life and our ancestor LUCA to get going. So if it happens so fast, why is finding LUCA so ridiculously hard? Well, imagine a crime scene that's 4 billion years old. The evidence has been trampled, weathered, and buried under layers and layers of, well, evolution. It's a contaminated mess. For starters, the very map we're using to trace our way back has changed. For the longest time, we thought life was split into 3 big domains. But, modern genetics came along and completely redrew the map. Turns out it's more like 2 domains, and we, eukaryotes, are actually just a little branch nestled inside the archaea. So how can you find the root of the tree when you're not even sure what the tree looks like? It's a huge problem. But the biggest problem, the real headache for our investigation, is that genes don't play by the rules. They don't just get passed down neatly from parent to child. There is this wild process called lateral gene transfer, or LGT. You can think of it like microbes just swapping genes with each other, like trading cards. It's a total genetic free-for-all. And what this means for our cold case is that the evidence, the DNA, is contaminated. It's like finding fingerprints from thousands of different people all over the crime scene. It makes it almost impossible to figure out which fingerprints, which genes, actually belong to our original suspect, LUCA. So, how in the world do you pull out the original genetic signal from all that noise, right? Well, this is where it gets really clever. Scientists came up with this brilliant new filtering method to finally cut through the contamination. First, they gathered a truly massive amount of data. We're talking 6.1 million protein-coding genes, and they got these from almost 2,000 different microbes, covering both of those big domains of life, the bacteria and the archaea. Okay, so the first idea was, let's just look for genes that are in everything, truly universal genes. The problem? That only gives you about 30 genes, and they're mostly just the basic machinery for reading DNA. So yeah, it tells us LUCA had a genetic code, which we kind of figured. It doesn't tell us a single thing about how it actually lived. All right, plan B. Let's broaden the search. How about we look for any gene that's found in at least one bacterium and one archaeon? Well, that gives you a much bigger list, about 11,000 genes. But now you're back to the old problem. The list is completely flooded with all those jumping genes from lateral gene transfer. It's telling you more about what modern microbes are doing than what LUCA was doing 4 billion years ago. And this is the breakthrough. This is the really clever part. The researchers designed a super strict new filter. For a gene to make the cut, it had to show up in at least 2 different groups of bacteria and 2 different groups of archaea. But here's the key. Its own family tree, its phylogeny, had to be clean. It couldn't show any evidence that it had ever jumped between domains. This was the genius move that let them filter out all that LGT noise. So what happened when they ran those 11,000 potential genes through this new filter? They were left with just 355. That's it. from 11,000 down to 355 gene families. This is the good stuff. This is the core genetic fingerprint of LUCA, finally cleaned of 4 billion years of contamination.
Okay, so now we have our evidence, these 355 genes. What do they tell us about our oldest ancestor? This is where it gets amazing, because for the first time, we can stop just theorizing and actually start painting a real, detailed picture of LUCA. Take a look at this. This whole diagram is basically built from the information in those 355 genes. It's like a metabolic blueprint. It gives us this incredible snapshot of LUCA's world, what it ate, what it needed to stay alive, and exactly where it might have lived.
And when you decode that blueprint, a very clear profile emerges. First, LUCA was anaerobic. That means oxygen was actually toxic to it. It was also a thermophile, meaning it loved extreme heat. We're talking boiling point temperatures. It was an autotroph, so it wasn't eating anything. It was making its own energy from chemicals. And its whole biology was built around metals like iron and nickel. Just think about its diet for a second. Hydrogen gas, carbon dioxide, nitrogen. It wasn't hunting or foraging. It was literally living on air, or, the specific mix of gases and chemicals that made up the early Earth. It was building itself out of the planet's raw ingredients. So, when you put all those clues together, no oxygen, crazy heat, a diet of gases, a need for metals, it points to a very specific address. There's really only one place on Earth that fits the bill: a deep-sea alkaline hydrothermal vent. These things are perfect. They're natural chemical reactors, providing all the heat, the gases, and even the energy gradients that LUCA would have needed to survive, maybe even before it perfected making its own energy. But the story doesn't stop there. It gets even wilder, because what these genes suggest is that LUCA's environment wasn't just a backdrop. It was so fundamental that it's literally baked into the core machinery of genetics itself. You see, our genetic code, even in our own cells today, depends on these special chemically modified molecules to work correctly. And it turns out, the enzymes that make these modifications, they trace all the way back to LUCA. It's like the genetic code itself wasn't invented in some clean, sterile lab. It was born in a messy, chaotic, super reactive chemical soup. And it still carries the chemical signature of that birthplace. And this leads to a really profound conclusion, pulled right from the paper. They say, it is beginning to look like LUCA was rooted in rocks. Think about that. This isn't just a story about some ancient bacteria. It's about a time when the line between geology and biology was completely blurry. Maybe it didn't even exist. Which leaves us with one last big question to chew on. If life on Earth wasn't some impossible 1 in a trillion fluke, but maybe, just maybe, an almost predictable consequence of a planet's chemistry, then what does that mean for our search for life elsewhere? What does that say about all those other rocky, wet worlds we're starting to find out there in the universe?